Another inspector. So just to note, you may see us talking, but decisions about the examination of the plan are solely mine and mine alone. Observations are standard practice in the inspectorate. Secondly, Louise tells me that audibility at the back is not so good, but that the PA system has been turned up as high as it can be without it not really working very effectively. So just a reminder to everyone, speak clearly and audibly and try and aim your voice towards the microphone. But can I also say, if you're at the back and you can't hear, you can come to the front. So please do that. And thirdly, we may need to pick up the pace a little if we're going to keep on track, though I think some of my questions can probably be dealt with more succinctly than the ones so far, but we might need to look at a shortened lunch break and sitting past 5 o'clock just to keep on track. So is everyone comfortable with that? Okay, good. Right. So we know the council suggesting deleting the stadium and the ancillary uses. Capital and Regional have argued that, well, if that is the case, and clearly that's not the position you support, but if that is the case, then that should not automatically mean that the plan should support a football stadium at Power Court, that shouldn't be the automatic alternative site, and the argument is that there should first be a full assessment of potential suitable locations for the football club to relocate, and one example was given, which is the Brash, which I think you said is a site controlled by the football club, and why could that not be used?
That's right.
Do you want to expand on that position, and then I'll keep it open?
Yes, so the consequences we're really dealing with here, aren't we, sir, of making the modification by deleting little 1 to 3 of LP5, yes. Yeah. So the first point so we'd make about that is that it would plainly be a main modification if such an amendment was to be made to LP5. Just a procedural point.
Would anyone disagree with that? No. Okay.
And so in a sense, if that is to be the case, then there'll have to be consultation and no doubt further consideration given to some detailed evidence about that in due course. To make that first point. In terms of where we stand today, it must be right, because I think all parties around the table, forgive me, I'm not sure this includes Historic England, but all other parties around the table agree that the in principle decision about where the stadium should be located is a matter for the early review rather than this stage. It must follow that even if 1 to 3 of LP5 were to be deleted following the main modifications process, it wouldn't provide in principle support for the stadium at Power Court. That's entailed, it's acceptance that the location of the stadium in principle has to be a matter for the early review. Mm. And so when that is being debated, then a full essay will have to be done in a way that hasn't been done, obviously, so far, looking at reasonable alternatives or any preferred option for where the stadium should go. And it would be part of the purposes of the evidence that we, inverted commas evidence that we submitted, is to illustrate that there is a deal of further analysis which needs to take place under the umbrella of a sustainability appraisal before that judgment about proper location for the stadium can be finalised.
Okay, let me ask the council's views on that, and specifically picking up the issue that was raised there, that it's one thing to potentially delete the stadium at Stockwood, but that doesn't automatically mean that this plan should find another suitable location for the stadium. So if you could answer that question, but also bearing in mind the position the council's taking on Power Court, where I think you at the start said you considered it to be suitable for a football stadium.
That's correct.
So that's a matter, no doubt, you're going to address at Power Court specifically, I assume.
yeah.
But so the council's position very much is that the stadium is a deliverable under policy LP9 with or without mod 22, and it's only if that position is not, as it were, upheld, whether through this process or another process, that any possibility of an allocation of a stadium at a site becomes relevant.
Okay, so yes, so what you're saying is at the moment, in the council's view, the plan has two possible sites for the football stadium, Power Court, Stockwood.
Correct.
But if it's not accepted by me that, in fact, that is the case at Power Court, the default position of the council beyond that is that finding a suitable site is, in effect, a plan review issue.
And so could I just add to that, this again may be a Power Court matter, but there is the elephant in the room, as it were, of the planning applications. And so it may be that in relation to the location of the stadium in this theoretical review, that the review could be expressed to be, as would simply make sense in a real world, conditional on whatever the outcome of the planning applications at that time may be.
Are you, in effect, saying the review might be a fairly straightforward issue because there might be a site with planning permission?
Exactly. I mean, that may be the reality. I mean,
Or, of course, it may not be, depending on what the outcome of
Absolutely.
the applications are.
absolutely.
And indeed, what might happen even if planning permission was given? And I suppose what I'm saying here is that not all planning permissions are inevitably implemented.
And some have been, some may be challenged, of course. So what the review would have to deal with the position as it found it at the time, which is why that sort of contingent expression of a review would seem to make sense.
What about the point made by Capital and Regional that you cannot really settle on a site for the football club until some comparative work, some comparative assessment of alternative locations has been done, potentially through sustainability appraisal? And that's slightly different from your position, which is saying that the planning applications may resolve it by giving a planning permission for a particular site.
I think our position on that, sir, is that over the years, a number of alternative sites for the new stadium have been considered. And I think it was probably around 2 years ago, something like that, that the football club looked at, I think, in excess of 20 different locations. And they sort of shared that with the council. And on the basis of that, the council appointed consultants specifically to look at the transportation implications of 4 of those sites, along with Kenilworth Road.
But that's not evidence before me, is it?
No. But I mean, the point is that in parallel, the work on the local plan was progressing. Junction 10A was retained as the sort of the stadium site as a legacy proposal, and carrying forward the commitment in the existing adopted local plan. And at the time, the potential location of a stadium at Power Court was considered in the SA because it was one of the strategic locations. So there's high-level strategic allocations within the plan. And that was at both Reg 18 and Reg 19 stages. So the SA considered Power Court as a potential stadium site at those two stages. But no other potential sites were considered by the SA because the council didn't receive any representations from any party, either at the scoping of the SA or on the SA during the public consultations, suggesting that additional locations should be included for a stadium within the SA.
But now you do have one, don't you? You have Capital and Regional suggesting one alternative site, the Brash. So is, in effect, go back to the question I asked, which is, if Power Court doesn't actually allocate that site for a football stadium, and it defaults to your position that the suitable location for a stadium is a matter for a plan review, is that in part or in totality because you think it would be necessary to go through a process of looking for alternatives to decide which is the most suitable? In other words, why would it need to be deferred to a review?
Sorry, I'm not exactly sure what you're saying. Are you talking about the Brace proposal?
Yes.
Capital and Regional have.
Well,
I mean, that's
being suggested as an alternative.
But my understanding is that the Brace was considered as part of the football club's sort of long list of more than 20 sites. In fact, I think there were a couple of proposals that were considered in that general location, and sort of they did not come out of the process as one of the locations that the football club were interested in, essentially. I'm looking across to the football club, but I think that's basically the position, isn't it?
Well, hang on, let me try and hone my question down. I suppose the question I'm asking really is that if Power Court isn't allocated for a stadium in any sense, you're saying the location of a football stadium is something that should be moved to an early review. So the plan wouldn't provide an allocation for the stadium. I suppose what I'm trying to untangle is why you would reach that view rather than potentially saying Power Court is suitable, given that you're arguing that Power Court is suitable.
Well, I think that's what we are saying. We're saying Power Court, we think, is a suitable location for the stadium and is capable of being accommodated within the existing policy.
Okay, and so you're disagreeing with Capital and Regional's argument that if there's a move away from Stockwood, that there is a need for a comparative assessment of alternative sites to be made first through the plan-making process.
Yes.
Before one could settle on Power Court as being the preferred option.
Yes.
Because that comparative assessment, presumably you would argue, might lead you to conclude another site is more appropriate.
I think I'm saying that we think the comparative assessment would lead to Power Court being identified, aren't we? Because those alternatives in broad terms have been already considered, and that was the conclusion that was reached from that exercise.
Okay.
So could I just add to that that the legal duty, of course, is to assess reasonable alternatives. The SA did assess at the time what were considered to be reasonable alternatives, having whittled down a much greater number of sites, as has been discussed, to two, Power Court and Stockwood. Stockwood would no longer be a reasonable alternative for all the reasons that have been canvassed this morning. And therefore one remains at Power Court.
I think Capital and Regional are arguing there is potentially another reasonable alternative, the Brash, and I suppose what I don't have is any evidence of any other sites in front of me, do I, except for the two, Power Court and Stockwood. So I don't really have any evidence of other sites in terms of a comparative assessment by the council. It's, if you like, a pre-existing conclusion you've reached that there are no alternatives. It's not one that's, it's a filter that lies above the sustainability appraisal.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
May I make a short comment, though, just to
Do
finish
you
up?
want to hear from me first?
Well,
I don't mind either way, sir.
go on,
Just to keep the points neatly, forgive me, Mr. Harris. I think the issue that arises, you heard Mr. Carter say that the reason that only 2 sites were considered in the sustainability appraisal was because they were the only 2 that were really on the table. Nobody else was suggesting any others. I think that's right from our understanding of it. It doesn't really, none of what the council said really answers the question that at the moment, if on the council's own case, the policy, whether it's amended or not by MM22, would in principle support a stadium at Power Court. There has not been, there isn't in existence, a sustainability appraisal which supports that, looking at reasonable alternatives. And that's obvious, even if one were to cast a moment's glance at the evidence that Capital and Regional have produced. So, especially, if you like, if the council's argument is right that you don't need to make an amendment to LP5 in order for the stadium to be accepted in principle, and that allocation can go forward, then one would need to do a sustainability appraisal looking properly at whether that preferred option has been assessed according to whether there are reasonable alternatives to it.
So you're arguing the SA is flawed of
Absolutely.
our court.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly, which is where the council is apparently saying that one way or the other, the principle of a stadium would be acceptable as part of the plan-making process. We don't, this 20 sites exercise isn't anything to do with the SA. It's not part of it, it's not a precursor to it, it's not referred to as a stage 1 of the SA. All we have is the work that you've got in the sustainability appraisal. Insufficient, we say, to support a Power Court stadium allocation at the moment, which is one of the reasons we understood why the council was saying it was appropriate for that to be left until an early review. We entirely agree with that.
Okay, let's take that discussion now. I'll come to the football club in a moment. I just want to ask the council about that. There's the argument there that the SA of the stadium at Power Court is flawed because it didn't consider reasonable alternatives when through the SA. I think that's your argument, isn't it?
Yes, it's possible.
Should have been a list of sites, in effect, that are discounted.
So one of the considerations as to whether an alternative is a reasonable alternative and needs testing in the SA process is whether it's realistic. Merely theoretical alternatives do not necessarily become reasonable. The council tested in the SA process 2 sites, one which had been long allocated and one which more recently had become promoted by the club. So that position hasn't changed. There is no suggestion, there is no evidence before the council that the Brace, or indeed any other site, is a reasonable alternative in the sense of being remotely realistic. If that position were to change, then the SA consequences may have to be adjusted. But at the moment, that is the position.
Okay, so really what you're saying is the time you put the plan together, the time you prepared the plan and did the SA, there were only two SA alternatives in play because those are the reasonable options. So what happens if during the examination process, theoretically, another realistic option becomes available? does that change things? Or has the plan preparation and the essay of it passed? Or does it come back into play potentially through main modifications, which might need in themselves an essay? Or does it depend on what the main modifications are for?
It depends on the main modifications, sir. If the position arises, contrary to the council's case, that a main modification is required for the location of the stadium, and if at that stage there is evidence that some other site could be a reasonable alternative, then it would have to be assessed. But that is not the position at the moment by a long way.
So just to run through the council's position, there's no need to look, deleting Stockwood Park, there's no need to look for alternative locations because the plan wouldn't necessarily be providing an alternative location. If I conclude that Power Court doesn't actually allocate a football club stadium, then you would default to dealing with that through a review of the plan, so there would be no need then to go searching for alternatives to SA. Is that right? And if in fact you're arguing that the plan at the moment actually allocates 2 sites for the football club, one of which is being deleted, then there would be no need to carry out further SA of the one site, Power Court, that is in fact being retained, because that's already been
application for a stadium could fit within the terms of the policy and the mix of uses as specified. It doesn't have to be an allocation. It just has to be within the range of contemplated uses, so that we don't have to go to the much higher test of whether LP9 allocates a stadium or indeed any other specific uses, because the whole purpose of LP9 is to be flexible to deliver what is undoubtedly a difficult site.
Sorry, you're saying LP9 is a flexible policy that outlines a potential range of uses that might be acceptable. So just run through again your argument how that relates to SA. Sorry, I didn't quite follow.
So it didn't. It was just a gloss I raised. Perhaps I should have raised it this afternoon, sir, on your use of the term allocate at LP9. You use the term, if you were to find...
I did, yes.
And I'm just respectfully having a quibble with you on the word allocate.
Are you suggesting LP9 is not an allocation?
So I'm saying that it allocates a flexible mix of uses, and the question would be whether a planning application for a stadium falls within those uses on a reasonable interpretation.
Okay, let's leave that there. Okay, the football club, the whole issue of alternative locations.
Yes, sir.
SA.
Can I just pick up the point that my learned friend, Mr. Lockhart-Murray, just finished with? In our view, the local plan contains one allocation for a football stadium for Luton Town Football Club, and 2 locations are identified where a stadium, as part of a mix of uses, could be policy compliant. Stockwood Park is the one allocation, and Stockwood Park and Power Court are the 2 locations, one by way of allocation, one by identification of a range of wide and flexible uses where a football stadium could be policy compliant. Our position in relation to the allocation, Stockwood Park, is that it should go because it's unsound and undeliverable. There has been no suggestion whatsoever of the existence of alternative sites until my learned friend Mr. Warren's clients put in their late inadmissible and inappropriate new evidence in December of this year. And it's for that reason that you don't have evidence indicating why the brace, for example, is inappropriate, for there exists such evidence in busloads. I'll come to that later. But if you agree with the local authority, sir, that the allocation should go at Stockwood Park for reasons of soundness, we are still left with an identification of a wide range of uses at Power Court, which clearly, on any view of ordinary English, could include a stadium as an appropriate part of the mix. If you don't accept that, which is the cascade approach you were adopting with my learned friend, then the local authority then go to a review. We've suggested it might be appropriate to withdraw to pause, but I'll not deal with that now. As part of that review, it would seem inevitable that as part of the review process, my learned friend Mr. Warren's clients would be putting forward some alternatives in any event, wouldn't they? And they would include the brace. So one way or another, if you go down the cascade route that you've indicated to my learned friend and you get to the review, the issue of alternatives will be considered as part of a review process, subject to the outcome of the applications, of course. As to brace itself, as I say, not mentioned at all by my learned friend, or indeed anybody else as an alternative, much less a reasonable alternative, therefore no evidence before you. But you do know, because Mr. Sweet has told you, and also Mr. Carter, I think, has told you, that 22 sites were thoroughly considered between the local authority and the football club. Brace was one of them. You ruled, and we've stuck by the rule, that we weren't allowed to deal with this in any other way other than orally, so here it is. Brace has already been ruled out on a number of occasions, including by inspectors in the past, for safety reasons, because of its proximity to Luton Airport, which in terms has a noise impact on the ability of spectators and those wanting to speak to spectators through public event broadcasts, etc.
Just before we get there, can someone come and point to where that site is?
Mr. Sweet will do it. As you've probably gathered, it's in very close proximity to Luton Airport.
Oh, no, sorry, there you go. So it's that site. All of that? Okay. Yeah.
Do you have it, sir?
Probably unfair to hold it up at this distance, but just so you know what's been annotated on there, it's the site there. Can you see that?
It's in Luton. We can certainly see that it's in. Yeah, we can see it. So
Happy with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Council's happy with that. Okay.
The point I'm making, sir, is that the local authority have not dealt with brace. We've not dealt with brace because it's not been raised until the very late and inadmissible new point was taken in.
You don't need to keep making that point.
No, I appreciate it. I'm sorry. But, the date is important, apart from anything else. The date that it was made was in December. It's right that, therefore, you should know that it's already been ruled out for safety reasons by at least one inspector who was considering the same argument that it was an alternative in the past. It is the proximity to the airport, the noise generated by the aeroplanes, which means that the...
When you say a previous inspector, was that through a planning application or through the last plan?
I think it was through... I'm just going to get the note up now, so I think it might have even been through the last but one plan. I mean, it's been long ruled out for these reasons. I'll get you the exact wording just in a moment. Also, as part of the assessment with the local authority of the 20-odd sites, there were, as the local authority have already indicated, access and transportation issues that meant that, in addition to the safety issues, aircraft noise, Civil Aviation Authority, etc., that the stadium at Brish would be non-deliverable. So it's been considered at great length. It wasn't even considered to be a reasonable option. Therefore, it's not formed part of the strategic assessment. It's raised now in a very late stage for the first time. No indication that there was an alternative issue raised by any other objector, not least this one, until December. So we would therefore summarise our position in relation to this in the following way. The one allocation for a football stadium is not sound because it's not deliverable. Power Court indicates a mix of centre uses which we think we are compatible with. Whether it forms an allocation, I'm with Mr Lockhart-Murray on this. I don't believe it does because it's too wide and too flexible. It's one of the options that might unlock our court. If you're not with us on that, then the review will consider alternatives inevitably as part of the ordinary course of events, unless planning permission has already been granted. Please give little weight to Brish as an alternative in the overall analysis, because it's only raised for the first time now, and there are very, very good reasons, historically, through decisions and otherwise, why it's never been progressed.
Okay, Capital and Regional, do you want to come back on any of those points before we move on?
3 points, sir. The first is about the essay and what was said and what was known at the date the essay was written. Your point, I think, sir, if the essay in support of a plan has to be kept up to date. And so if there is evidence that the authority has in front of it dealing with reasonable alternatives which it hasn't considered as part of its essay, then it must do so. So that's the first point I make, sir. And that's leaving aside early review. That's this process that we're in. The second point, sir, is to try and assist you on how to deal with this evidential kind of interplay of what's admissible and what isn't. I mean, there is a danger, I think, of, as you know, so we entirely understand and abide by your ruling on what we should be discussing at these hearings, but there is a danger, I think, of asymmetry and unfairness if you're accepting evidence about PA systems and safety reasons and so on ruling out sites without having looked at the evidence on the other side of the coin. So I make a freestanding procedural note of caution about that. But what it illustrates, more importantly, sir, is that this issue of which is the appropriate site, what are the reasonable alternatives, plainly isn't fully exposed to your scrutiny as part of this process in the SA. And it thoroughly underlines why it needs to be done as part of, if it is an early review of the plan. Thirdly, sir, I'm trying to resist the temptation to jump ahead to Power Court, but there's such a connection between the two. It's inevitable, sir, and I'll say this no doubt in a slightly different form if you'll forgive me later on today, that one will have to come back to consider the alternatives to the stadium in any event as part of an early review, because the Power Court proposals with a stadium requires major retail at Stockwood Park in order to work. And that major retail is not part of this plan as currently submitted or indeed proposed to be modified. And so inevitably there is going to be a necessity to come back, whether as part of this process or as part of an early review, to consider both impact of major retail at the junction and whether there is a better alternative site for the stadium.
Okay, I allowed the football club to comment on the merits or lack of them, the alternative sites.
Yes.
I'll give you the chance to comment on the merits of that site.
Well, see, it's difficult. I mean, I genuinely don't want to open up areas that you've been absolutely clear that you don't want to hear evidence about at these sessions. We have looked, and I take the point about the date and not having said it before, I entirely accept that. It isn't in the end an answer to whether it is a reasonable alternative site or not. Well, that has to be a merits judgment. And we have provided evidence, and I'll do no more than just refer to it. We have looked at it. in today's circumstances and proposed it as something that is worthy of serious consideration as part of an SA.
And really you're saying that in connection with Power Court, in either alternative, the alternative that the council's proposition is that the site is actually, well, whether we use the word allocation or not, the site is suitable for a stadium in the plan, or in the alternative that it isn't, but then it's allocated, or there's a main modification to allocate it. In either of those circumstances, you're saying the current SA is flawed, and therefore in either of those circumstances, further SA work is needed.
Yes, I don't think that the difference between the two is really substantive as far as the outcome of the planning process is concerned. Whether you read it into the existing wording or not, one needs to look at reasonable alternatives in a way that hasn't hitherto been done, we say.
Okay, and that SA could potentially take place through a main modification, if I thought that was appropriate.
It could do, but that's why I connected it with my third point to the major retail proposals at Stockwood Park. It would have to be part of the overall assessment, because the whole notion of the stadium, whether it's a reasonable proposition itself at Power Court, depends on it being cross-subsidised by retail at Stockwood Park. The whole thing will have to be looked at, not as it were, advancing piecemeal against a proposition which is in fact linked up.
Okay, does anyone else want to comment on that? In a way, I want to leave it there because I think it'll come up again this afternoon. So, just to conclude on potential main modifications in relation to Stockwood, the council's position is clearly understood, so that is a potential main modification. I don't think you've mentioned criteria 9, 1X. If you turn to that. If what you seek ends up as being a modification, would 1X have any relevance? In other words, it says enabling development will be of a scale that doesn't adversely affect the regeneration of Luton town centre, but presumably if the policy is modified to delete the stadium, ancillary supports and the enabling provision, points say 1 to 3, then would B9 have any relevance? Because there wouldn't be any enabling provision.
That is correct.
And we agree with that, sir.
We'd make a slightly different point, which is that, as an answer to the question, which is that what we haven't covered off, I think, is what happens to the Stockwood Park allocation if one simply promotes a main modification to take out Little Roman 1 to 3.
Okay, I'll come on to that.
You've got to come on to
We'll come to that, yes. But on that specific point, criteria B9 refers to enabling development. The only reference to enabling development earlier on in the policy is in A3, which talks of enabling provision associated with the football stadium. So is not the logic that if 1 to 3 are deleted, then 9 would also be deleted, because all you would be left with would be B1 use and a park and ride facility?
Yes.
Okay, so
I mean, I suppose an alternative to deleting that paragraph would be just to delete the word enabling.
Well, how would that relate to a B1 use and a park and ride facility? Because presumably you've set your business use on 9.5 hectares in a way that wouldn't adversely affect the regeneration of the town centre.
Yeah, that's correct, sir.
So there's nothing left.
Apart from the land that the stadium and enabling development would have been located on, I suppose.
Yeah, but then the policy would only be allocating 9.5 hectares for business use and a park and ride facility, wouldn't it? They will come on to discuss what it will allocate.
Yeah, and it would be subject to review anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're suggesting adding LP5 to the list of items to be considered in an early review. So how would that be worded in your view? Are you talking about a review of uses for the strategic allocation at Stockwood Park? Is that all it would need to say?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Would there need to be any consequential changes to the supporting text? So, for instance, would the supporting text need to provide any context about the football club?
Yes, it would. It would have to. We'd have to look at the supporting text.
So what would that, I mean, well, I suppose the question is, would it need to explain what's happened here? That it was a preferred site for the location of the club?
Yeah. Yeah,
But now it isn't.
It's paragraph 444 would need to be looked at.
Do you have any idea what it might say? Are you talking about an explanation as to why the football club proposal has been deleted and what's left in effect?
Yes, and say that the site would be pending review in the new policy, cross-referring to the new LP 41 or whatever it would be.
Sorry, say that again.
Yeah, and it could usefully make a cross-reference to the new policy about the local plan review process and what would be included.
Okay. Has anyone else got any specific comments about how modifications might be worded, which is essentially what I was covering there?
To LP5.
Yes.
May, you said you were going to come back to the issue of what's left if you
Yes.
take out.
Yeah.
So I'll reserve our comments to that point.
Okay,
If I may.
that's fine. I wanted then to move on to the football club's representations, which advance a line of argument about out-of-centre retail, which is, in effect, if I'm to summarise them, that if a stadium is built at Power Court, there won't be sufficient space to deliver all the identified comparison retail needs in the town centre. Although the council argues that some of those needs can be met on other sites, and we'll cover that later. And the football club's argument is instead this comparison retail need can and should be met at Stockwood Park instead, and you argue that would be beneficial. Well, you said it would complement the town centre, including the Mall, by drawing new retailers and shoppers into Luton and forming an attractive gateway. And that's linked with the argument that a delivery of a stadium is difficult in viability terms. It's been discussed, and you've said not viable at Stockwood, even more difficult at Power Court for various reasons. And your argument is that overall then retail development at Stockwood could cross-subsidise stadium at Power Court, including through providing an ongoing income stream. So I think I mentioned that earlier, and you said that is still an argument you are pursuing, in effect.
Yes,
So is it the football club's view that Stockwood should now be allocated for out-of-centre retail? And I suppose my question is it the role of the plan to allocate out-of-centre retail, looking at what the framework says? So if you've got it, I might just take you to paragraph 23.
yes.
If I very briefly try and run through that. I think it's the 6th bullet of paragraph 23 that says, allocate a range of suitable sites to meet the scale and type of retail development needed in town centres. The 7th bullet says, allocate appropriate edge of centre sites for main town centre users, with a bit of qualification, and if sufficient edge of centre sites cannot be identified, set policies for meeting the identified needs in other accessible locations well connected to the town centre. And then the 8th bullet says, set policies for the consideration of proposals for main town centre users which cannot be accommodated in or adjacent to town centres. So if I was to summarise that, does that in effect mean identify your town centre retail needs, meet them in your town centre? If you can't meet them in your town centre, meet them on appropriate edge of centre sites. If you can't do that, set policies that would allow proposals to be considered for other locations. And it is in effect that policy LP21. So is the framework in effect saying that's what the plan should do rather than allocate a site?
Well, so yes, but set policies is not restricted in its meaning, and if there is a clear and obvious approach which is sustainable, it seems to us that that could include allocating for mixed-use purposes, because that's what the suggestion is. We don't allocate for out-of-centre retail per se. We allocate for mixed-use purposes, and of course the application which is before the local authority is actually, in aerial terms, employment-led as opposed to retail-led. What we're seeking is that the site should be identified as a site where it would be appropriate for mixed-use purposes, including retail, to assist in meeting the objectively identified needs of the town. So, and this is part of a strategy which we say is an appropriate strategy as opposed to the existing strategy, which will just result in much of the same. So you'll be aware, having been here for a long time, that Luton is punching well below its weight given its location. That's a criminal waste of an opportunity. There are two existing spatial strategies which have signally failed. The first is SO9, Strategic Objective 9, which is to find a new stadium for Luton Town Football Club. That's been expressed in at least the previous two plans as an objective, recognition going right the way back beyond 1996 that Kenilworth Road is not appropriate. And the second spatial objective is that the retail needs of the town ought to be met in a way which affect a step change, a significant increase in its market share. Now, we'll come to some of this tomorrow, perhaps. The emerging plan just repeats the failed strategy, rather blindly, we say, and without reference to the evidence of failure of those two elements of the strategy. There is, however, we think, a hugely exciting potential for mixed-use regeneration led by an iconic community stadium for the town centre at Power Court, and the meeting of the town's other spatial needs, including retail at Stockwood Park. And we say the meeting of the town's needs, including retail at Stockwood Park, is appropriate not just because the stadium is the right thing for Power Court, although it is, because we don't believe that Power Court will be delivered in any event. It hasn't been delivered for the last 20 years, and the evidence in terms of viability that we'll look at later this afternoon is clear in our view. It is unlikely to be developed in the future, largely because of the infrastructure and decontamination costs associated with that. We say the mixed-use retail provision on the Stockwood Park site is justifiable in its own right in terms of the NPPF because it would meet an objectively identified need at a sustainable location, whereas provision at Power Court would not. It's historically failed and would fail again. Power Court is an appropriate location for a mixed-use development including a stadium, see this afternoon, and such a mix of uses including a stadium, which we say is capable of being a main town centre use, is also appropriate to be located on the town centre site. If that takes place for viability reasons and because the stadium will take up space, there will be an inevitable need, given the identified need, objectively assessed, for further retail space, for somewhere else to be identified. And we say setting policies for meeting the identified needs in other accessible locations points you directly to our site, which has already been identified as appropriate for built development, for strategic employment use, and is well located, accessible, and well connected to the town centre. So for all of those reasons, added to now by the fact that we say that strategy is deliverable because we are the owners of both sites, it's for those reasons that we've consistently proposed that the plan should be amended specifically to embrace that strategy. And whether you call it a formal allocation or not, there is nothing in my submission in paragraph 23 which means that you are unable to set policies for meeting the identified needs on Stockwood Park. Simply nothing. And it's for those reasons that we have historically and continue to argue that that is the best way forward. Of course, our reserve positions, which you probably don't want to hear from me now, but our reserve positions identified shortly are that if you remove the stadium from LP5, very clear consideration ought to be given as to whether the whole plan should be withdrawn, or there should be a pause, or there should be a review. Now, I'll deal with those under a different heading, I suppose. But so you are right. We were suggesting and continue to suggest that it's appropriate that this mixed development, including retail, should be located and pushed towards Stockwood Park.
Okay, thank you. So from the council's perspective, what's your view on that issue? How would you regard the framework on that issue and the football club's proposition about what should be allocated?
Well, our concern about the retail is that the plan's strategy has at its heart a town centre focus, and the idea of a step change in the sort of the offer within the town centre is all part and parcel of the strategy of the plan.
Okay, but let's just look at a scenario where you've already said you would support, you consider the plan supports the football club at Power Court. I think then logic is you've accepted that that site, coupled with the others, won't be able to meet all of the town centre's retail needs. That's correct, isn't it? And you've said that might then need to be a review issue.
Yes, that might be the case, and what we said earlier was that we would wish to undertake the review of the town centre framework in order to, in effect, consider the fallout of that position.
So are you saying that would be in effect to explore options that don't involve going out of centre or beyond the edge of centre?
I think our understanding of the capacity within the town centre on the sites that are currently known about is that, we put in our evidence that we think that there is sufficient capacity in the relatively near term to deal with the issue of the additional comparison retail within the town centre. And in terms of the overall quantum of retail that the plan talks about over the plan period, it talks about an amount of around 30,000 square metres up to 2025 and around 50,000 to 2031. But I think with the proviso that would need to be subject to review at some point. We should probably before we get to 2025.
So, okay, so really what you're saying is even if you lose some potential for retail development in the town centre, you think you've got enough capacity now for a number of years, and what you do, and then it would be appropriate to both review retail need and then presumably locations to meet that retail need.
Yes.
So that would be a review issue, and that would be your preferred approach rather than at this stage looking to Stockwood to meet that retail need.
Yeah, that's correct, sir.
Okay, what about the proposition I put to the football club, reading through paragraph 23 of the framework about allocating land for retail beyond the edge of centre? The football club effectively said that's what the framework says, but it doesn't stop a plan allocating, if we're allowed to use that term, land beyond the edge of centre.
Yeah, if I'm interpreting your question correctly, the plan's comparison retail proposals effectively are on sites which we would deem as edge of centre. They're within the town centre, but on the edge of the main shopping area.
Yeah, well, we'll cover what Power Court is, but I think your position is it's an edge of centre site.
And so therefore, Stockwood Park would clearly be out of centre, and therefore you would have expected to have gone through the sequence before getting...
The proposition I put to the football club reading the framework was the framework asks you to assess your town centre retail need, allocate sites within the town centre as the framework defines it, which is not quite the same necessarily as town centre boundary in your plan, but we'll come on to that. If you can't allocate town centre sites, allocate edge of centre sites. If you can't allocate enough edge of centre sites, set policies to consider proposals for main town centre uses which cannot be accommodated in those locations. And I suppose the question to the football club was, does policies there mean a policy, a development management policy that allows you to assess an out-of-centre proposal against the sequential and impact tests, or does it include an allocation? I suppose what I'm asking is it the role of the plan to allocate out-of-centre sites in any case?
We think it's the former of the two options that you suggested, and LP21 includes provision for that.
The former being that the plan's role is to allocate town centre sites, edge of centre sites. If it can't, a sequential approach policy.
Yeah.
Capital and regional.
Firstly, so there's no dispute, I think, between the parties here that the aim of town centre policies is to support the town centre based not just on national policy but on the work that's been done about the strength of Luton town centre. And that's what the authority says. Obviously, it's matter 13, reps on page 3. This is a town centre which is anchored by the MAL, but which is in need of further investment against some quite strong sub-regional competition, including emerging competition. And so that's the position that we're starting from in terms of the evidence here. The effect of out-of-town, out-of-centre retail at Stockwood Park would be to divert expenditure away from the town centre, including all of its linked trips and multiplier effect. And the full extent of that impact is not before you. Capital and Regional have had a look at it. It's one of the main reasons, obviously, why Capital and Regional is very concerned about the idea of the whole proposition which is being slowly and steadily advanced here, which is the stadium at Power Court and displacement off.
When you say would divert expenditure from the town centre, is that are you referring there to both existing expenditure and potential expenditure?
Both, sir, absolutely, in part. In part, it's going to take away new floor space provision which could be made right next to the town centre on a site which, for I think everyone accepts, could be made functionally to work as part of the town centre. But also, inevitably, there is going to be some leakage of expenditure from existing floor space in the Mall to and out of a town facility such as is being mooted, particularly when you see, and I'm not sure so the extent to which you've seen this, the way that those proposals are described in the application, the kind of as an illustration of the kind of thing which is likely to be proposed. So my second point, sir, is in essence that in order for you even to begin to consider a main modification, one would need to have very substantially more work on the impact consideration of major retail at Stockwood Park, which you do not have. The third point, sir, is that plainly.
So that's the impacts on Luton, on its vitality and
That's
viability.
right, absolutely. Yeah. The third point, sir, is that clearly major retail at the junction, including providing floor space there rather than at Power Court, on the face of it, doesn't comply with the sequential approach. And if one were to, just addressing your question, which is strictly speaking on retail, on the application of national retail policy, to apply national retail policy to it, then it would fail that policy test. And so any version of this which feeds through into main modifications could only do so, so we say, if you had been able to take a view about the extent to which the sequential test had been addressed, whether the degree to which it was failed or passed, and we are many, many, many miles away from that having been done yet.
Sequential test, presumably, are you referring also to the impact?
Absolutely. Well, I put that first because that impact worked. We obviously have very serious concerns about that. One of our concerns is still trying to grapple with a clear understanding of what those impacts would be. We have our own views, we have some fears, but of course that hasn't yet been worked through. And I know that White Young Green are on the job for the local authority, but that work isn't yet, as I understand it, public in the context of the application. It's certainly not before you, sir. It makes it very difficult, we say, to even countenance a main modification of this kind. Fourth point, sir, even if the stadium idea at Power Court isn't accepted, and I don't understand, I'm not sure the extent to which this is being promoted either by the club or by the council, but if there is to be no stadium, whether you call it allocated or provided for in the Power Court policy, then clearly there's very little justification for major retail at Stockwood Park. We are as you were as far as the town centre retail.
Sorry, what was where did that scenario start with?
I beg your pardon?
That was
Yes, even if the stadium does not come forward, I think one of your alternatives here is if I don't, one way or the other, countenance a stadium at Power Court, the position then is as you were when the plan was submitted. Edge of centre site at Power Court, sequentially preferable to others, the obvious location for a substantial quantum of the retail need to be met. If, on the other hand, fifthly, sir, there is to be a stadium at some point at Power Court, and that is an assumption that's made, then clearly one would need to do the job of finding sequentially appropriate and impact appropriate sites around Luton to take up the displaced, to meet the displaced needs. And that, as I understand it, is why the authority says there should be enabling, if you like, policies or general criteria-based policies to deal with that. We would suggest, that's a sensible suggestion, but of course it runs entirely counter to any idea at this stage of a main modification allocating the Stockwood Park site for major retail. And as my final point, so as I understand it, that is not what the authority wishes, considers appropriate, or intends to do, from hearing what Mr. Carter said a few minutes ago. It isn't part of the authority's approach that there should be major retail at the junction if there were even if there were a stadium at the Power Court site. One would need to do a proper exercise about that. Now, if that's right, I just draw out one final point. If that's right, and we suggest that that would be correct, then it's difficult to understand the logic of the authority's overall position, supporting on the one hand a stadium at Power Court, which on the evidence will only come forward if the club and 2020 developments builds major retail at the junction. They've taken steps to acquire some or a large part of the Power Court site. Their evidence is absolutely clear that it requires cross-subsidy from retail at the junction, but that isn't something that the council supports. So how, we ask, is the council in a position to support the principle of a stadium for Luton Town? And the point's been made a number of times, this is a specific user proposal, which is only feasible on the club's evidence if they're able to build large-scale retail at the junction. And that's a real difficulty we see with the logic of the council.
Okay, let me ask the question there. The argument is your support for a football stadium at Power Court is not logical because the argument is it's premised on out-of-centre retail subsidising it, cross-subsidising it.
The council has requested information from the football club in terms of viability and retail impact, and until it's received that information and is satisfied with the outcome of that information, it's not in a position to determine the planning application.
I'm not sure that quite answered the question. Let me ask it again. The argument is that how can you support a football stadium at Power Court given that the understanding is that the football club is in part justifying that on the basis that it needs cross-subsidy from out-of-centre retail?
We haven't accepted that.
We don't know that position. It is a statement of the football club. The football club are saying that there is cross-subsidisation, but we have not seen the viability assessment to be in a position to confirm, from our position, to confirm that.
So is your position really then that you're just saying that a stadium could potentially be an appropriate use at Power Court, full stop?
And
Yes.
and it needs to be funded.
Yeah.
There are different ways of funding it than cross-subsidy from major retail development at Stockwood Park. Or any other location.
Okay. Right.
I just give you a reference, so just to finish off on that, forgive me for jumping in. Just have a look when you're considering that answer at paragraph 721 of the Indigo document, the main representations on behalf of the football club, December 2015. And this represents the position unchanged, I think, in the later Indigo reps on behalf of the club. It says, it talks about how difficult Power Court is to develop, which is something that everyone acknowledges. However, with a development that delivers high-quality retail, leisure and business floor space at Junction 10, the club will be able to facilitate delivery of the stadium and other uses at Power Court through cross-subsidy. So that's what the club is saying. Now, if one's to give weight to what it says about never going to Stockwood Park, then it seems only fair to give weight to what they say about the need to cross-subsidise the stadium by major mixed-use town centre uses at Stockwood Park.
Okay, any final comments from anyone on that issue? Okay. Probably cover this issue now because the strategic objective in the plan, strategic objective 9, I'll just cover it while I think about it. The objective says to deliver a new Luton football stadium in a location capable of good access, transport infrastructure, etc. So there's an objective in the plan to do that, isn't there? Let's just run a scenario. Council's arguing that the stadium at Stockwood Park should be deleted. You're arguing Power Court is regarded as being suitable for a football stadium, but let's just follow the hypothesis that if I don't accept that, then there isn't an allocation, or what we might call an allocation, or some other term for it. There wouldn't then be any provision in the plan for a football stadium, would there?
That's correct.
Where would that leave strategic objective 9 then? So there would be an objective for the plan to do something for which the plan was then unable to do anything about because the specific allocation was deleted.
In that scenario,
But our court may not potentially be allocated for that, and your position, your preferred position on that is that the football club issue is then left to a review of the plan.
yeah, that's what we discussed earlier, isn't it? Because nobody is suggesting that strategic objective 9 should be removed from the plan, are they?
Well, I suppose that's my question. Where does that leave, if there is no provision in a plan and the provision is in effect being left to a review of the plan, and that's one possible hypothesis, isn't it, or scenario, then where does that leave this? Is that reasonable then to have a strategic objective saying the plan will seek to do this if then it transpires that the plan doesn't do it? It instead says it will do it through a review of the plan.
Well, it remains an aspiration, doesn't it, in those circumstances? I think retention of the strategic objective would still encourage the process to try and ensure that the alternative stadium site is brought forward.
So you wouldn't think it would need to be deleted or amended in any way?
We would think that the essence of the strategic objective should stay. I mean, I suppose another alternative would be an enabling policy of some sort.
Okay, what do you mean by an enabling policy? You mean a policy that says the council will support the provision of a football stadium in an appropriate location?
And subject to achieving the following criteria, something like that. You know, its key attributes.
So that wouldn't be site-specific, it would be a development management policy.
In effect, yes.
Yeah.
Right, let me ask the football club that. There's two questions. I asked the council one question, but their answers prompted a second one. So if we follow the scenario through where the provision for the football club stadium is left to a review, so the plan doesn't provide an allocation, if we call it that, to have that strategic objective. And in response to that, the council said two things. Yes, it is. It still remains an aspiration. But then there could be an enabling policy, I suppose, development management policy, which says we will support the football stadium subject to it meeting a number of criteria.
Yes. So in terms of SO9, we believe that it should stay, and indeed nobody is suggesting otherwise. There's not a single objection, to use the old terminology, to SO9. It's been a long-standing requirement of the plan, evidenced and fully supported by previous inspectors.
You say that even if the plan ends up not actually making provision for a football club?
Well, I do
it's
say,
left
but
to a review. That's the scenario I was running.
Exactly, sir. And first point is that a policy identifying the importance of finding a solution and an early review is itself a form of policy which seeks to put the objective into play. So it wouldn't be as if the plan was entirely silent on meeting the terms of the objective. It would recognise the difficulties that arise and indicate that there would be an early review. Just as in the same way, a strategic objective is to fully meet the objectively identified need for housing. But it might not all be capable of being achieved, but there's subject to a review, which is a way of the plan dealing with it.
Right, so you're saying you could conceive of a plan which says SO9, deliver a new football stadium,
Yes.
with then policy whatever saying, because this is all rather difficult,
Yes.
frankly, it will be covered in an early review of the plan.
I am saying that, that's part of my answer, and that's a usual thing, especially nowadays, for inspectors to recommend. It means that the objective is identified and confirmed as appropriate, and a means of finding a solution is set out in a pragmatic and practical way. But there's a second answer, because this isn't the first time that the Planning Inspectorate have had to grapple with this issue, and exactly the same thing happened before Stockwood Park was allocated, where an inspector felt that it was inappropriate on the evidence to identify an allocated site, but drafted and caused the local authority to adopt a criterion-based policy of the type that was just being suggested by the local authority. That is something that's happened before, specifically in relation to Luton Town Football Club. Unfortunately, it hasn't produced, for reasons that we've identified.
Which plan was that?
This,
Is that a current plan or a...
No, this was the inspector's report into the 1996 inspector's report, where the inspector was urged to identify Stockwood Park, said he didn't think that it was sufficient to deal with an allocation, and therefore promoted, with the acceptance of the local authority, a non-site-specific generic policy, which indicated when a stadium and how a stadium might be dealt with, and then on the Stockwood Park specific site added a tailpiece which said in terms positive consideration to Luton Town Football Club being located at this location may be appropriate. So no site-specific allocation, but a criteria-based policy which reflected the still then extant strategic objective to deliver a new Luton Football Club football stadium. So those two responses to your question, clearly...
So you're suggesting either could be appropriate?
Yes, and indeed, or both. But simply to remove the strategic objective would be wholly artificial and inappropriate. Strategic Objective 3, it might be argued, is unlikely to be achieved by reference to the other policies in the plan, but the review mechanism seeks to achieve that too, at least in full.
Is my recollection right that the council was going to look at SO? The change was a long time ago now. The change was discussed to SO3, which is about delivery of housing. I might be wrong. I might be imagining that.
I think we did.
Yeah. Anyway, okay. Capital and regional. Same two questions, really, in a scenario where the plan doesn't make any allocation for a stadium, but leaves the issue to a review. What should happen to SO9, and is one of the things that should happen to SO9 being a development management criteria-based policy?
Well, so we certainly have never taken any issue and don't take an issue with SO9 in principle. It's a very important use, a very important part of Luton life, and Capital and Regional obviously supports it in principle. But I think there are difficulties with retaining a single scheme objective. It's a little bit different, I think, in kind from early reviews to meet housing needs. If a specific objective, strategic objective of a plan is to facilitate and provide a new stadium for a particular user, then for the plan then to say another version of this plan will do it is bordering, I don't put it no higher, but bordering on the ineffective as far as the soundness tests are concerned. But so what is the pragmatic answer to this? We've got concerns, I think, about a criteria-based policy, and one would need to see it, I think. I mean, one can think of obvious criteria which such a policy should contain. For instance, shouldn't affect the vitality and viability of the town centre, I think one of them. But it's a little bit difficult to respond more substantively than that without seeing the kind of policy that we're talking
Obviously, about. we don't have one now, and we could spend quite a lot of time potentially discussing trying to draft one in.
Because it would need to be effective. I think the evidence is that there was one and it wasn't effective, and it seems to us that this is a very important user within Luton. It's a very important strategic issue, and so really the purpose of the plan making system is to try and resolve this one way or the other, rather than to hedge our bets and just have a criteria-based policy. Our view, may I just restate it so that it's in the context of our overall position, is that the Stockwood Park allocation should be left as it is, because that does the job of SO9. And if that, when all of these matters are considered fully, is found to be correct in planning terms, then that is something that the owners and backers of the football club will have to consider.
Okay, thank you. Any more on that particular issue? No. Okay. Right, I'm going to suggest that perhaps we stop there for lunch, and I'm going to suggest we come back at 1:55, if that's okay. So that's a 30-minute lunch. I think we are still running slow in that we're still on my question one, but in a way that was the most substantive issue, and I'm hopeful that some of the others we can get through more quickly. Are we still confident around this table that by sitting a bit later tonight and the session tomorrow morning, we will still get through everything?
I think we are. I think
yes.
we are.
Okay, good. Right, so if we come back then, are we okay to come back at 10 to 2? Is that long enough, 25 minutes, or do you need a bit longer? Be realistic.
I'm not the right person to ask on that. I don't know how quickly it's going to be to get something.
Are we safe for just saying 2 o'clock, which is 35 minutes?
Right.
That's nice. Everyone can remember that. Let's say 2 o'clock.
We'll all be in the same.
Yes, we will be in the same.
Okay, thank you.